Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Friday, wherever y'all are at. Today we're going to be doing a demo day of GitHub. We're going to be talking about GitHub Actions, great functionality you can do there, and not just around CI/CD, which of course is important, I'm sure, to many of us, but also just automation in general. What can we do with issues? What can we do with labels? What can we do with assignment of people? The platform is so extensible and well used by thousands of users and customers. For our enterprise product, we're really excited to share it with you. My name is James Haw. I'm a GitHub Solutions Engineer. I'm based here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. I'm joined by my moderator, Mr. Dean. Would you mind introducing yourself, buddy?
Of course. Hey, folks, I'm Dean Stavropoulos, also a solutions engineer here at GitHub. Going to look to moderate the chat, currently pulling up the chat box right now. Feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to look to answer some of those, maybe ask James some of those questions, and then just shoot over relevant links. So let's have some fun.
Most excellent. Thank you so much, Dean. And that's right, guys. We want to keep it interactive, so please feel free to ask questions along the way, and we'll be sure to answer them as we can. All right, I'm going to be sharing my display now. All right, so the code I'm going to be using for this also is in a public GitHub repository that we will share with you a little bit later in the call. And we'll have the exact same source code because I know people always want to see the references and how it works. So today we want to talk about and see what can we do with GitHub in terms of auto-magically doing some cool, needful little things across our software development lifecycle. So for today's demo, I'm actually going to use an issue ops to go and create me some prerequisite material for this. And while I'm going through this, I want y'all to think about things. How are different ways that you could use this to automate, maybe in your company or just in personal projects you're working on? Whether it be, hey, every time I want to make a new pull request, maybe I want it to comment a specific message or add a little trademark at the bottom of it or denote certain type of material for when we're starting on something. Why not do that in GitHub? Why not standardize that so it's a repeatable process? And that's what we're doing here. So with this issue, I'm actually going to go ahead. This is actually what we use for demos of GitHub itself to our different customers here. I'm going to go ahead and give this demo a name. So today I'll just call it Twitch Demo Days. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that value into my issue body. I'm going to go ahead and submit this issue. So when I'm doing this, we're actually going to see a couple fun little things pop up here in the background. So for those not familiar with GitHub Actions that much, a lot of it is going to be driven through what you see here, the Actions tab. And we'll go through how Actions themselves work. But as you can see, this little spinning icon is showing me that something's actually in progress, as we can see in the little handle. If we actually go look at this GitHub action, the workflow file, which is just YAML formatted, so probably something you're very familiar with if you've used different tools or platforms such as Azure DevOps or Jenkins, you can see here the language behind GitHub Actions. We'll dive into this for some of the different examples we use because we have about 5 or so workflows that run off this. But at a high level, I want to explain a few of these different concepts we're going to see. So at the top, we're saying, hey, on. So this on event basically lets us specify what type of GitHub activity we want to trigger this workflow from. So in our case, we're going to trigger it from whenever an issue and of what type of specific event for that issue is opened. And then going down here for the steps, we give the workflow file itself a name. Then we have this job section. So that's how we can break out the work that's going to occur for our GitHub action. So when we have different jobs here, we're going to define different events that are going to occur. So these different jobs, my first one is called act on issue. And we say what exactly is going to happen. So the cool thing with GitHub Actions, if you're not aware, you have an option to run these in our GitHub hosted cloud. So these are run for you. For our public repositories, it's actually free. And with our free accounts and different levels of team accounts, and then eventually enterprise customers, there's a certain amount you can use for private repos per month as well. But basically what happens is, in this situation, I'm going to run this just on an Ubuntu VM. Somewhere out there, I don't have to worry about the infrastructure or anything like that. I just tell it what I want it to do. So in this scenario, we're actually going to be putting in a conditional, this if statement right here. And I actually use this quite often. It's pretty intuitive if you've done really any form of development, right? When do we want certain things to happen? In this scenario, I'm saying, hey, if the event that triggered this, because whenever you're inside a GitHub action, the cool part is you can pass through the different context of what is occurring. And we do this with this GitHub event, the issue, if the title of it and we're using this constructor here, starts with demo, or if the title of itself starts with reset for another process I want to use, it's going to go ahead and follow through these steps. If this does not match, then no worries, my issue is not going to be affected by any means. So the steps here in this first really high level part that we're doing, all we're going to do is just check out the code through this actions/checkout. And then we're going to go through and actually run a command of different scripts that actually exist in my repository. So the great part about checking this out, this code in our repository now exists in the VM, and we can actually modify it as we need to. So that's what we're going to do. I'm actually going to go through and actually run a couple of different scripts that I'll show you. And those scripts are actually going to make changes to this project itself and kind of add in some commits, really without me ever having to put my hands on the keyboard. I can do that right from a GitHub issue. A couple other things you may be noting though. Hey, what's that thing called secrets right there? That seems like it may be useful. I see those are referenced a couple different places. So with GitHub Actions and really any sort of CI/CD or automation engine, when using workflow files, odds are we're going to have to interact with different systems. And how do we do that? Through secrets, API keys, connection strings, etc. But the biggest challenge is how do we actually secure those? You don't want that to leak, and you don't want to just have it available in plain text, obviously. So the great thing with GitHub Actions is we have a built-in secret store that you can use and then specifically reference in your action files without ever having to hard type them in themselves. And I'm going to actually show you what it looks like in the experience. But in the chat, y'all let me know, is that ever an issue for anyone before? Trying to figure out the best way to manage your secrets, making sure none of them get out there or available for others to consume maliciously or not? Would love to hear any thoughts about that. So I'm going to go to my settings. I'm going to go to my secrets. And you can see here I actually have two different secrets defined. So one is my Azure creds, which we'll take a look at. This can be great because we're going to be deploying a web app to Azure right from GitHub without ever having to touch the Azure portal at all. And this Azure creds is going to help me do that. So I just populated this from my Azure portal. I generated an Azure SCA key, and I put that into GitHub. And as you can see, there's no option to actually view it. I can only update it. So these are read-only secrets. And you can see if I want to make a new secret, I also can do that. I just give it a name. And then I give it a value. And once I add it, it's now there and available. Once again, I can't actually modify it. I can only update it. So I want you to make sure you're always taking advantage of the opportunity because that gives you a great way to, one, manage these and make sure no one is abusing your secrets that may be available or insecure somewhere. That's at the repository level. But a cool part about GitHub is at the GitHub Enterprise and GitHub organizational level, you can also define these different secrets. So I'll show you what that looks like here. If I go into an organization, if I go into settings, we can see we have similar things here. Oh, for actions, we can manage some of those different controls. But for secrets, we can do the same thing. However, we can actually set up secrets at an organizational level. And this is really cool because then these secrets can be shared to different users and different repositories across my GitHub organization. As you can see, some of these secrets are available to all users, all repositories, and some are only available to really specific repositories. So you can see there when you try to update this, I can say what type of repos do I want to have access to the secret in their GitHub Actions. I think this is awesome. I think this allows you to have better control over how people are maybe rolling their QA keys, pre-prod keys, and of course, keys like production. We want to make sure those are always being controlled by the right people. So I'm going to switch back over here to my repository. I see there Hyperchain Labs. I see you mentioned that similar to Docker secrets, possibly, I believe so, in some form of management. And in the GitHub context, though, what's great about it is we'll put whatever value you need in there that needs to be securely stored and encrypted. So I go back into my Git issue we created earlier. I'm going to click on the one we've just made. As you can see, this was made 6 minutes ago. The GitHub action that we saw run in the background went ahead and actually made a comment for me as well saying, hey, we actually created a new feature branch. And if I click on this, we navigate here to my branch. So great. And we can actually see some files were even modified 6 minutes ago. That's weird. I didn't actually do anything as a developer besides just create an issue based off a template. And then if I go here, we can actually see in my views that a change was actually made to this index.html file itself. Let's actually take a look at that commit. So what actually happened there? So I have scripts that are in my folder structure here that I can reference. They're just bash shell commands, literally. So I'm just doing a git checkout. I'm doing some just simple regex replacement. I replace the value customer that's in the original file with the name of whatever branch I'm using. So in this case, Twitch-demo days. And then I commit that in, check it back in, and now it's available for my entire repository in this new branch. So once again, you can do so many cool things with actions because at the end of the day, it's just a virtual machine. So definitely feel free to experiment and see different possibilities you have with it. All right, so let's go back to our demo. So I'm going to go and create a pull request. I actually include a link to do that right from this issue, just to speed up the process. And right here, I'm actually using a pull request template to actually provide some information on how to use this. So it's telling us, hey, how do you want to deploy? It's going to be based off the use of labels. And then how do you actually tear down and remove these resources? Here's some different options as well by removing labels. So I'm going to go ahead and create this pull request. I'm actually going to be switching context, y'all, between two different accounts. Okay, so I have my GitHub user account that is both the owner of this repository and organization and namespace, as you can see. And then we'll be using another account that is actually just a general user here. That's this account that you'll see. It's called Phenomenal. Excuse the pun. So we're going to do a couple different things, me switching context, just to show I want to build in controls essentially against who can actually deploy to my repository, right? And you'll see exactly why here. So I'm going to go to that pull request that James made earlier. All right, so there's a couple different cool things I want to do. You know what? I think I just want to go ahead and deploy this thing into QA or prod because why not? I'm sure it works. I'm not going to review it or anything like that. So I'm going to click on the label because that's what it's giving me directions here to do. Okay. Let me just go ahead and try to deploy to prod. Let's see what happens. So once I click that label, we're going to see a few different things occur. So we just see that this notification here, we can see some checks have started from GitHub Actions. So these GitHub Actions checks are going to be intrinsically linked to this pull request from which they are triggered off of. So that's a great thing about Actions. You can use them to automate and mandate what has to pass in your CI/CD. If I go back up here into Actions, we can see that this just ran. And you can see it's called deployment on pull request label, which is exactly what happened. I'll show you a quick look at this workflow file and exactly how we're going to build in some different controls. So quite similarly, we're running this on specific types of activities. So in our case, it's on a label activity, right? And then whenever that label activity is being used, we're actually going to pass it through as a local variable that's going to be available to the rest of my scripts in here. And my first job, actually, I'm just doing a permission check. So I'm simply wanting to see, is the person that actually performed this activity, the GitHub actor, is what it's referred to. So the person actually put that label on there. Are they actually the repository owner? If not, then this step fails. And if that step does fail, we're going to do a couple of things extra here. So if it fails, we see that, hey, they are not actually the GitHub repository owner. We're going to actually go right down here and make a comment saying, hey, someone attempted to trigger this. That was not supposed to be done. And also, since it failed, we're going to go down here and do a couple of things too, such as removing the label as well, because I don't want that clutter to add up anymore. So let me show you what actually happened at the pull request. So I'm going to go back here. So we go down to the comment history, and I like doing these for my actions just to give some context and history and visibility into what is actually occurring. We can see, okay, so my GitHub Actions bot commented 43 seconds ago saying, hey, someone tried to deploy this. It was that user Phenomenal, and they are not the repository owner. And in our scenario, trying to deploy to prod, that's going to be stopped. So no steps further were taken. And it even went ahead and just removed that label just to clear up that clutter as well. So that's an example of, okay, how do we build in some controls or guidance around who can do what in our repository? But let's see what this user actually can do. So I'm going to go back and click on labels. Let me just, for testing purposes, let's just deploy to dev, right? Let's go somewhere safe that we can test this out and these changes and make sure nothing is going to break our code. All right, so now if I do the same thing as we saw earlier, we can see these checks have just kicked off again. I want to go over to my Actions tab because I want to show you this in real time because it does happen pretty quick, at least for these pretty lightweight actions I have available for me. But you can see first we're going to be going through and using a permission check. And then you can see it actually went to the next step where it says the label was applied. So you can see a check actually did fail, but that's okay because the check itself, it was just seeing whether or not I'm actually a repository owner, as you recalled earlier. The following steps we have actually, though, I'll show you the workflow file, are going to say whether or not, hey, even if I'm not a repository owner, what can I actually do in terms of deployment? So remember this job called permission? If I scroll down here, I go to my next job called deployment. You can see we have one that's called deployment to label based to dev. So what happens is basically the label dev. If it is, okay, we're going to create some more content down here to let us know what's going on. And then we're actually going to be doing a few different things and creating what we call a GitHub deployment event. So deployments in GitHub are really cool, and we're going to be using these heavily in the demo because it basically lets you define a space and a name for where you want to deploy your code to. It's really more of just a container and a logical way to structure and create updates to. Okay, something actually failed. Let's update that deployment has failed. Oh, it's passed. Here's where it's at. And here's even a URL for it. And just further leveraging the power of the GitHub community, I actually needed a way to get the branch name of the pull request I'm triggering this from, but there was no way out of the box to do it, at least that I could find. So what I did actually is just reference a pull request from a user out there in a public GitHub repo that they've published in the marketplace for others to consume, which is really the power of the GitHub marketplace. I'll show you all that real quickly, because in these uses tags you'll see throughout, all they are is just a URL slug to a GitHub repository. So you can see this is someone's repo. Shout out to Matthew Coleman. And we can actually see, hey, this is published to the marketplace. And here it is in the GitHub marketplace. Gives a couple details on how to use it. Obviously the original repo where it came from. But if you go to the marketplace in general, you can see there's over 5,400 GitHub actions available for use, which is an incredible drop. I think Dean and myself can both attest to that. We haven't been here too long at GitHub, probably under a year both, but when this first launched, it was GA in November or so. And over, I think, the past really 2 months or so, we've added at least 2 or 2,500 actions. So that's a great part of such an open platform and solution that anyone can contribute to, from large companies, as you're seeing here, from companies such as Docker, Ansible, Amazon, Azure, to just general users, as we saw there with someone adding in some nice functionality that they found a use case for. All right, so going back to our script here, we can see the deployment was kicked off. I'm actually using this GitHub action from an actions repository. I definitely recommend you checking out this GitHub Actions organization and the repositories they have available for use, because those are made officially by GitHub themselves, and there's a plethora of actions available for your use cases. This one's called GitHub Script, and I love it because I can just run simple JS scripts from my GitHub action workflow file without having to go into machine or enter bash shell commands or reference a script file, etc. You can just run these different commands such as creating issues or comments or labels. And we'll actually use that quite heavily in this solution as well. All right, so going back here, I'm using my GitHub script action. I'm actually going to go ahead and create a deployment. I'm just going to pass it a couple different, required parameters and contexts, as you can see here. And the main one I want to note is this payload. So this is really great because you can basically pass it a payload of information to be included along with the base parameters it has. So I'm going to pass a couple things here. I'm going to pass in the pull request number. This is originating from the label that we use to kick off this deployment, as well as the branch name itself as well. And you'll see why that's valuable for us here in a bit. And then lastly here, I'm going to go ahead and actually just go ahead and assign this person to the pull request, because, hey, you decided to kick off this deployment, so I'm going to put a little bit of onus on you to track and be a part of this pull request then. So if I go back to my pull request, let's click in here. Okay, we see a couple things have been happening as we went through that. So first, let's start from the top down. So earlier, we tried to attempt a trigger to prod. That was blocked because of our permission script that we saw in there in that job. So that was stopped. You removed that label. You're not able to do the activity. All right, fine. I actually am giving people the flexibility to deploy to dev if they would like to, though. Excuse me. So what's happened is I actually do get a warning message saying, hey, someone's trying to deploy dev. It's this user phenomenal. They aren't a repo owner, but the deployment will continue because it's just dev. I'm not too worried about it in this situation. So it's saying that we're going to go ahead and grant approval for this. They're requesting a deployment event. And then down here, it's saying that we've actually went ahead and made a deployment for the specific ID that was created in that previous issue for that deployment event activity. And I'm actually going to be the one that's going to be deploying these based off the context of my account as the organization and repository owner. A couple other things happened, but I do want to backtrack and show you those throughout the process. And I see we have a message from Faust that said nice. Yeah, I think that was probably a reference to maybe the marketplace and some of the GitHub scripts actions. They are really nice. And we'll actually take a look at a couple that I worked on myself because I just had a really specific use case for information, and it's out there as a public GitHub action as well. So if we go back to our Actions tab, let's see what happened. So our Actions tab, we can see that there was this additional event triggered deploying this .NET application. So I click this. We can go in and take a look at the workflow file as well. A couple things happen you will recognize, but the first I want to note is, hey, this actually triggered on a deployment. One thing I want to specify, in order to prevent circular actions from just running continuously, you cannot trigger an action from another action in pretty much all scenarios. However, what we did in this scenario is we actually created a deployment event that gets sent to your GitHub repository. And now that deployment is something we can use to trigger a following action. I think this is a clean scenario of how to do that, obviously, because deployment events are very encapsulated and tied to a reference, a SHA, or a pull request in this situation. And that's how we're going to actually pull in that payload of information that we set earlier as well, if you recall. So we look in here. All right, so on the deployment event, this was triggered on. Great. We can see for the event deployment, we can actually grab, remember, that payload that we identified. So I identified a payload in there for an issue number, a reference tag, a label, and then, or just a regular property off that deployment is the ID I also want to grab down as well. I'm going to define a couple more environment variables that I want to reference and use within the following jobs I'll have. And those include references to what is the web app name for dev, QA, and prod for the different environments, as well as what is the Azure resource group name in my Azure subscription that will be created, as well as, hey, what Azure location do we want to try this out of? So for me, being based out of Atlanta, Georgia, we'll use the East US region. All right. So similar to what we had before, we're going to be doing a permission check again. It's just going to see, hey, is the person that's going to be responsible for this event, are they actually a repository owner? And it is, because it's going to be triggering the context of my user account. That's where the deployment's running from. The deployment technically is not being triggered by the phenomenal user we had earlier. They simply made the request in there, and then me as a repo owner is the one that's actually going to be running this in the GitHub Actions context anyways. Obviously, I didn't have to actually do or touch the keyboard much outside of a couple button clicks. So we go down here. We're going to go to the steps that actually do a deployment to the different environments. So our first step here, we're going to be deploying to dev via label. So we can see in this first label, it's basically saying, hey, you're going to deploy to dev. All right. And we're going to be doing a couple different updates here. So if I go down here, I'm actually going to go ahead and update the deployment status. So it's going to go from just being a blank deployment to being in progress. And it's going to update a couple of values in here as well. And you can see I actually grabbed that deployment ID as well that I passed from the GitHub event. Next, I'm going to create a comment. That's what we saw, saying, hey, someone's requesting to make a deployment to this environment. And here's the ID for that deployment as well. And scrolling down here, we're going to be using a couple different GitHub Actions and commands from both .NET. As you can see, GitHub Actions.net. That's going to give us access to these different run options for version 3.1.101. And it's actually going to go and publish this application. And to actually make the deployment, we're actually using this other GitHub action by the Azure group themselves called login. And here's where I'm going to use my GitHub secrets we specified earlier, if you remember, for my Azure credentials, right? Because obviously it needs a subscription tied to it because it's not free to host web apps, at least in this situation. So it's going to create the resource group for me based on the name I spoke about earlier. I'm going to go ahead and make a deployment as well. Let me scroll down here a bit more. Once that deployment is done, it's going to go ahead and log me out of Azure. I actually have a step in here because I want to check and make sure the response to that Azure website I just deployed is valid and available. Once again, another GitHub action in the community from this user. And all it is, hey, what response code do you want to have? I want just a simple 200. And do you want a timeout for how long we're going to wait for it, et cetera. But another good check to know, okay, my deployment made its way through Azure with no issues. I'm now checking it with a different step and job from GitHub Actions. And then I'm going to go ahead and update the deployment. So basically, this is another if condition. So basically, if all the steps in this job pass and are successful, this condition is going to go ahead and run. And once again, we're just using the GitHub script action. And we're going to go and update the deployment status to be a success because it has been deployed to Azure successfully. We've done some different checks. And then we're actually going to go ahead and apply some comments and then add a label as well as that pull request. If it would have failed for any reason, any of those steps, then we would do another update, but we have updated to a failure for some reason, and then add another comment as well for visibility into that failure. I'm going to go back to my pull request. Any questions from the audience on that? Does that make sense? Okay.
Folks, keep those questions coming in.
Yeah, feel free, y'all. There's a lot of goodness in here, and sometimes we just get kind of lost in how cool it is, but we'll be happy to dive into any different areas. So now I'm back at my pull request where this really all started from. Then we went through and looked at a lot of different things that occurred, and you see as I'm scrolling down, a couple different things happened, right? So we can see some of the comments that are made. All right, someone's making a dev deployment. It was triggered by this user, but they went ahead and tried to make a request. It seems like things went through. And then some of those update comments I mentioned before, hey, this was successfully deployed to Azure. Awesome. And here's that deployment that we made. If we go and click this link for view deployment, we should see a live Azure website. So it's just a simple bookstore, very lightweight, but went ahead and carried in that change I made via my issue ops to update the title there. You can see it's a live website. And we see one of the books actually available there is Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren, which is now a PhD at GitHub, and she's part of our developer velocity research team. Very bright, and that's a really awesome book. So definitely recommend that if you've never checked it out before. All right, so I'm going to go back to my pull request. So, okay, we saw a couple things. We saw a user can just make a simple dev deployment. That's fine. But what other checks have you built in, and how is that really going to help me manage this entire life cycle? Because you can see I also applied a label after the deploy to dev. So now it's the Azure Dev Live. So you know that, hey, deployment worked, and this was actually added on there. Let me actually try. So I'm back in my owner context. I'm saying, okay, we made a dev deployment. That's probably good enough for me to deploy to prod, right? I don't really care whoever has any say in that. I'm just going to go and click this deploy to prod label. So I go to click that, and let's see what occurs when we do so. I'm going to go over to my Actions tab. You can see another deployment event just occurred for deployment on PR label in our Actions tab, and this is currently running. So we click on this. Let's look at a few different things that are occurring. All right. So it looks like the permission check worked, because that makes sense, right? Because I am a repo owner. And we see that step, the permission check, it passed. But some other checks seem to fail here. Oh, this one called validate prod requirements. We actually skipped over that. And it looks like this update PR for being failed for prod actually ran instead. So what I'm doing, and this is just a single use case I have, but I want you to think about, hey, how can we apply some of these different practices to some of our internal processes, maybe at our company, or just my team of developer friends on a open source project possibly. So what we're doing is we're making a check for permissions, right? We're seeing, hey, are you the repository owner? If you are, great. That's one step that needs to pass. However, down here, I'm doing a step called validate prod requirements. And why do I do this? Because I want to make sure, okay, if you are trying to deploy to prod, I want to make sure you're at least up into QA with a successful deployment. And as you saw earlier, whenever a deployment is done successfully, it will actually create a label saying Azure-environment name live. So in this situation, I'm checking, first off, if the label that triggered this ends with prod. This is another cool constructor you can use for these if and conditional checks. Okay, it's true, right? The label I did was deploy to prod. And if it contains in the pull request all the labels, that array that's possibly available, if any of their names include Azure QA Live, then okay, cool. It's a valid deployment because we're saying this has already been deployed up to QA. However, if not, then we're actually seeing something that I just found out about not too long ago, is you can actually check the steps for different activity inside your GitHub job. And if the outcome of that step was passed or failed or success, you can also use that as a parameter too, which I think is great. So what I'm doing here is if this previous step prod check, you can see this ID reference here, is skipped, go ahead and run these following commands here. In addition to, of course, is, hey, was it actually, was the permission check a success? And then was the label that triggered this entire workflow run ending in prod? So basically my check there is, hey, is this actually a valid user? Okay, they are. But was the previous step, the validate prod commits, skipped? It was. And once again, verifying that this deployment is trying to go into prod. So what happens here is this triggers, and it's actually going to create a comment and remove a label that we applied earlier. So let me go back here. Let's validate that all occurred. Because once again, we want to make sure that we're following the proper procedures whenever it comes to deploying secure code. So I scroll down here a little bit, you can see, okay, it looks like 2 minutes ago. So it's showing that I did a deployment trigger. It was me. To prod, but requirements were not met, so that deployment was actually stopped. And then I once again built in the bot, just asked it, hey, can you go and remove that label? Because obviously that was not a successful deployment, and we're only deployed to dev here still. Okay, fine, fair enough, fair enough. Let's go ahead and try that QA deployment though. We saw before that we're blocking the just regular phenomenal user account from deploying the QA based on that repo owner check. So I'm actually going to do something. I'm going to actually pull up and let me share my phone because I want to show how we can do deployment when we have some things built in like this right from our mobile experience with the GitHub app. And while I'm getting this set up, I hope people out there know there's an app for both iOS and Android for GitHub. It's actually quite awesome and really convenient to just check your repository, see what's going on in regards to your source code. Okay. So I'm going to pull this up here. Sharing this over. So I get that the full screen. Let me make sure we can see it. All right. So essentially, I'm going to go to my home tab. I'm going to go look at my pull request. I apologize if some people are having issues from it. Let me just go through this real quick. Just going to my specific repo that we've been working on. I'm going to go look at the pull request on that repo. And I'm going to go ahead and update it, update the label that is right from this experience. So I'm going to go and update my deploy to QA label. I apologize, sometimes screen sharing is not the most fun here, but I believe I got it done. So let me go back here and we can see I at least wasn't touching the pull request. Let's verify if that happened. Okay. So we should now see that the deploy to QA label has appeared. And we can see that I went ahead and added that about 35 seconds ago from my mobile app. So I don't even have to be on my keyboard or at my desk or in the office, virtual or otherwise at this point in time, to approve or make some different deployment options or moderate the software development lifecycle for my team. So I'm going to scroll back up and see, all right, that label has just been deployed, and we can actually see, hey, it looks like some more comments in here that was actually granted access to. So it's going to go and deploy up to QA, and we'll see how that works. But once again, looks like our deployment step was passed because, hey, permission check worked, and we can actually see the label worked as well and deployed off to QA because I have the right permissions. There weren't any checks that we're building in for prod specific protections. So now we can see the deployment to QA itself is also triggered off. I'll give it some time to go, and you can see throughout the process of my pull request what's actually going to be occurring. It's back at the PR level. We go here, we can see in our show environments now, hey, a new deployment was created and its status was just updated as well into pending, as we saw in those previous steps, which I think is great. We can kind of see in real time what's happening, in addition to, of course, making comments if you'd like to along the way, letting people know, hey, who's deploying what's been approved, as well as seeing this environment being pushed up into our environment. So let me go back to that action. It's very similar to what we saw before that y'all noted. But this time instead, it's going to be triggering the QA deployment because once again, we're doing a check in that situation to make sure that the label, whatever was applied and brought over for our deployment event, actually matches up with QA itself. So for our QA deployment, yep, if the deployed environment label that was passed through via our payload equals this, go and run these following steps. So great modularity to reuse code or create different branching situations of how a script or action file is going to run. I'm sure you also think of plenty of different use cases for that, whether it be spin up a certain type of environment or container or images, or create certain types of pull requests or features or comments for team members, depending on different scenarios you may be in the process of doing. But same steps as we saw before, it's going to go ahead and log into Azure, deploy out there, and once it's successful, it's going to go ahead and update my pull request comment as well. So let's go back here to this label. And while this is actually updating, I want to show y'all how simple it is to code a GitHub action with one that I have done for this exact situation. So another public GitHub repo and really simple action out there. Happy to have some contributors, people look at it. Definitely collaboration is the spirit here at GitHub and open source in general. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this action. So I had a need to get the deployment ID whenever I'm deploying to specific environments. And this is necessary because in order to actually update a deployment itself, I need that deployment ID, but it's not something you can necessarily pull off the fly every single time. You can pass in some different pieces of information, but there are certain steps in my script where I actually need to just be able to grab it intrinsically and actually sort by whichever one matched the label I had, because I could have several different types of deployments as well. So what this deployment action does, just a simple JavaScript. And all I'm doing down here is I'm going to just pass in different reference tags, something called environment name. So it's going to be based off that label we have. And then from there, I'm just going to do a simple recovery of, hey, what are all the deployments? These are actually returned in an array for my environment. And then from there, I'm going to filter down and then actually get the ID I need in order to do the needful and then update this. And we'll see why I'm doing this and what exact process here in a little bit. All right, so I think we just saw our successful deployment to QA. Yep, that's what we're being told anyways. So let me go verify that as well. Awesome, so we can see here our Azure websites QA was also successfully deployed. So that's great to see. All right, so lastly, we're gonna do this deployment to prod. Let's just verify that our checks we had before are now passing because we do have a tag here that says Azure QA is live. Great, we wanna verify that. So now, even though I'm a repo owner and that is added, I should be able to actually make this deployment to prod happen after going through the checks I've defined in this scenario. Obviously, there's several levels of granularity y'all can make, right? Is the pull request mergeable? Is it a specific type of user, for example, or maybe a referencing a list of users that are available for that? Plenty of flexibility in this model because essentially at the end of the day, it's just code, it's reusable, and it's consumable. All right, so we're doing a couple things here. We can see our permission check we had before actually ran successfully. And then here, the validate prod requirements also ran successfully. So great. So we know that, hey, it's going to be able to go into prod. And we can see that since this step wasn't skipped, it actually passed, that the following step, the updated for a failed production deployment, is no longer an issue. So I'm going to scroll down here. Same thing we had before. It's going to go and kick off a deployment event. If I go back into my pull request, we should be able to see the same thing we've been used to. So we're seeing here, I went ahead and made a deployment request, and now we went from 2 active environments, dev and QA, to 1 pending environment. That's the production environment that we're wanting to work on. So this is going to run the same way you did before, but right now I want to answer the question I usually have of how do I manage these things, especially when it comes to test environments. They may be consumption-based in containers or in Azure or maybe another cloud. It can be a pain if some of y'all have had this experience of managing those and making sure that you're not having a large consumption of your subscription credits, especially if you're using on a free tier or school tier or company tier available. So I try to build in a couple different ways for me to manage that and be able to kind of just tear these down as needed. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go and tear down one of my environments. So let me try this. So I'm going to go and click this Azure Dev Live. This label is applied once the environment's live. I'm doing so there. So I'm going to go and unlabel that. If we go to the action tab, we're going to see that an action was just triggered off here for Azure Teardown. So another workflow file that we've set up, this time on a unlabel event for your pull request, which I think is a cool scenario because in this case, I just want to really drive this off labels themselves, but you could probably drive this off assignment, comment specifically, right? If a specific type of comment is added in there for deploy. Maybe by a specific user, go ahead and run a certain type of action. In our case, we're going to run this on the unlabeled event for the pull request. And what happens down here is a couple more checks. One, I want to make sure someone's tearing down resources. I'm going to make sure they're a repository owner. We just have that check in there available. And then for my dev environment, it's going to run through and say, hey, the label checks out. It's the same label. We're going to go through and run these Azure login scripts. It's actually going to go through and delete some of these different resources that we had earlier. And then I go here and click on this deployment ID event. This is what I actually need that action I specifically wrote myself for. So GitHub's great because if you need something, just build it inside GitHub. Whether through actions, we have a great API set as well as webhooks as well. So in this case, I'm going to grab the deployment ID. I'm actually going to store that as a variable here for the outputs of this specific step based on the ID. Once again, you can reference different steps in your actions by their ID, which you can specify. Then if I scroll down here, we're actually going to go ahead and update the status of that environment as well, that deployment that is. Obviously, we're using deployments a lot, so I just wanted to kind of remain and keep a level of consistency when things are going around through that process. So I'm going to go back to my pull request, Twitch demo days. I'm going to scroll down here. See, my branches have been deployed. So these statuses should update here shortly. But as you can see, it looks like prod was also deployed itself there. All right, great. So once again, we have 3 versions of our reading site that have been able to be deployed and able for us to check and validate throughout our process. Maybe running different levels of checks or linters or maybe Selenium manual testing or anything else. You can definitely have that added in there. And I see there we have a James Harries. Yeah, loving that, man. You obviously have the longer names. So I think you win in this situation. But mine was always easy to fill out on Scantrons and the SAT. So that was always a great perk, I suppose. All right, so we can see we went ahead, went through, did our teardown, did our deployments to our different environments. I'm gonna go back up here to my actions. You see some different components have ran in there as well. Actually, let's take a look at this Azure teardown. A step might have actually had to fail. You know what? Actually, it's using a different version, but that's no issue. I'm actually show y'all something. Let's do something not on the fly per se. So no worries. So shoot, one of my teardown steps for Azure failed. Bummer. But this is actually a good use case to show something called manual triggers with GitHub Actions. This came out maybe 2 or so months ago. And there was a need from users and a lot of our enterprise customers of how do I actually just run a GitHub action when I need to run it? I don't want to necessarily trigger it off a timer or specifically off a GitHub event per se. So I'm going to go here into where it says Azure Cleanup. And I can actually run this workflow, as you can see, right from the UI, which is pretty cool. And a couple things about the way this works. I'll show you the workflow file for here. So workflow file. So very simple GitHub workflow file as you're used to seeing, I'm sure. In this case, we actually specified a couple things. So I actually have specified a cron schedule, so I can run this every night at midnight. So hey, every night at midnight, go ahead and destroy this Azure resource group. It's just a test environment. Once again, I don't want you to run at my subscription. Or you can use this workflow dispatch event as well. And it's really not even an event, it's really just a trigger, I should say. And it accepts a couple different parameters you can specify, one being inputs. So we can say, hey, a single input for this is going to be this. It's called Azure Resource Group. And this is what you can then reference later on inside of the different scripts itself. So what we're going to do is basically say, if this Azure Resource Group value is required, that's the description of it. Once this is entered in and ran, the GitHub action can use that value and run whatever script you have. So I want to go back to my actions. Let me go and run this. Let's go ahead and clean up all those Azure environments. Azure cleanup. Yes, and hey, I just saw a question in there. Apologies, don't want to mess up your name, but is that Nitin? You can add, of course, yeah, definitely additional inputs to manual triggers for that as well. I'm sure Dean probably have a couple references we can share you for that, but you can add as many as you want. You probably saw that in the workflow file. We just add one that'll show up here, but you can add several actually, which is pretty cool. So I'm gonna go and add in the name of my Azure resource group. We go run this workflow file. We can see, okay, that was successfully requested at least. That's right. Just running it right from the UI. And this step is going to do a couple things. Once again, I'm doing another permission check. I reuse this component, but I think it's good because I just want to make sure you're who you say you are whenever you're trying to do some operations, maybe such as deploying to prod or removing or deleting environments or values. This is pretty cool though, because there's a step that's called needs. So we're basically saying this step in this job can only run if this previous job permissions passed, right? So you can build in dependencies to your different jobs. So definitely note that. We use that throughout the solution as well. Okay. Looks like this is going ahead and going to be running for us. We'll go ahead and finish up. And sadly enough, I think all those pretty environments we set up along the way might be going bye-bye. But that is what we wanted in this scenario. Always had to have a contingency plan. All right, so I think my Azure environments are going there. Let me see if these are still available. They still are. And you can see I'm really just running an Azure CLI command right from my virtual machine itself. So that's another cool thing about this. Your CLIs you need out there from anything such as Terraform, Azure, Heroku, etc. You can always install those usually on the runners and then see how those are referenced and be able to just run the commands as you would normally. So it's another really beautiful part of the GitHub Actions infrastructure. It's really simple, super easy to get started with, and there's a large ecosystem of providers to look at. And while this is actually finishing running, let me show you our marketplace. Let's take a look at some of these actions that we were referencing earlier. I highly recommend you all take a look at the GitHub Actions marketplace. There's a large plethora of different actions to look at, but a couple of different ones that we have here. This is one I wanted to look at. There's one called the Azure CLI action. So this is great. You can go even look at the exact repo it came from. You can see it's from a verified creator. And you actually see, hey, the source code of how it actually works, and maybe some more information about exactly how the script runs. But essentially, we're doing a couple things here. So we're going to be able to log into Azure and then check out different Azure resources. And that's the great part, because then we can use this additional script here, the Azure CLI script, and just run whatever commands we need. In this example, they're using AZ account show, or look at the storage. In our example, we're actually using this to tear down resources. So really powerful, and definitely recommend you looking into this for whatever cloud of choice that you're using out there. But the Azure integrations I've worked with at least have been pretty useful. Okay, so let that finish up running. I want to show a couple more things that actually just came out this week regarding GitHub Actions, especially for managing your enterprise and GitHub organizations. So here I'm at a GitHub organization. I'm going to click on the settings. I'm going to go over here to my actions section. And a couple things we've had questions of before for managing your organization or a team of people. Actions and open source obviously is great. It's really consumable. But obviously the question of security, knowing where things are coming from and what things we trust, has always been a question. So with GitHub Actions, you've had a couple permissions before for your organizations. You can say, hey, what organizations are able actually to use actions? All of them? Maybe only a subset of them. You want to select only a couple repositories that can use it. Or, hey, they can use actions, but only they can use local actions. So only actions that they basically include in their repository. Once again, it's just code, and you can reference it locally as well, but it might make your repo a bit heavy in a lot of situations. Or now this is awesome, because you can say, hey, use selected actions that match specific criteria. We had a blog post about this literally, I think, earlier this week, if not last week. But I definitely recommend you checking this out. It could be really useful for your enterprises, your organizations, in terms of what you need. So you can basically say, hey, actions created by GitHub itself. You know, we have specific repositories out there that we manage and create actions for, such as that checkout that you saw, or maybe set up nodes, set up Azure, things of that nature. Or only allowed from the marketplace creators that are actually verified, meaning that their GitHub organization is a verified organization. The way that happens is a company will basically say, hey, we own this domain. So we are actually, you know, azure.com or hashicorp.com, etc. Or shoot, even specify a list of actions you want people to use as well. So try to play around this. You can use a nice little mix of different actions as well to suit your use cases. Also, something I wasn't too familiar with recently was just the ability to be able to retain logs of artifacts as well and specify the time frame for it. You can't go over 90 days, but if you're worried about things such as your storage consumption, definitely feel free to, I guess, bump this usage down as well. All right. And once again, I know we did talk about secrets, and I can set those up at both the org and local level with your users. Okay, so let's get back here. So say my job completed. I'm seeing no errors. So if we can verify, here's my resource group. Oh no. Well, it was a nice one lasted, but it looks like we lost it. But that's what we wanted. The resource group itself was destroyed, and I'm no longer too worried about my Azure subscription being drained, you know, midway through the month, which I think maybe some of y'all have in that situation, but that's happened to me one too many times. And of course, once you actually need it for piloting or testing something, you can't anymore. You have to wait at least a week or two. All right. So we went through a lot of different steps there, y'all, in terms of GitHub Actions. We saw going from an issue itself to a pull request to labeling to comments and different activities being occurred both inside of GitHub as well as externally with things spinning up in Azure, etc. I know we have a few minutes left here and happy to stay on. Any questions on what y'all have seen and Actions in general, or really just the GitHub platform in total? There's a lot of wealth of information out there, but happy to field anything from y'all. I really appreciate the feedback. And while we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and share you the public repo where you can also view the source code if you'd like. I did promise you that. I just pasted in the chat there from username jtrainchoochoo. So feel free to take a look at that. And copy it, fork it, whichever you'd like. Always welcome and open to pull requests for improving some of these solutions. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know, y'all. I'm going to walk through a couple more things with Actions that we sometimes get questions on from customers in terms of maybe writing and managing and the flexibility behind them. So one great thing, right, is we want to make sure that Actions, they can encompass CI/CD as well as automation as you're seeing here. But I did a couple things, right? I did a deployment to dev, a deployment to QA. How do I actually make sure what I did is required, right, before this can be merged into our main branch? So I'll go here. And I'm using a branch protection rule. You're probably familiar with this if you've used GitHub in the past or on a big team, but basically branch protection rules, you can define a name pattern, see what branches this will apply to, and basically these rules you set up will protect your branch, hence the name. So before anyone tries to merge into my main branch, we have to follow these certain parameters. So I'm going to require, hey, at least one person has to approve the pull request or a review, or you can have multiple, or certain status checks that have to pass before merging. So these status checks, these are what's going to be your CI/CD. We have a checks API you integrate with, and a lot of providers out there do in this field. So Jenkins, Travis, Circle, etc. Or it's an API, so you can also integrate with it and make updates to the GitHub pull requests as things are happening. But what we can do with GitHub Actions, they automatically show up here, which is great. So if I want to say, hey, before we can merge this pull request, a couple of different things have to pass. So it has to deploy to dev properly, has to deploy to prod properly. We want to make sure there weren't any issues with that. If I save those changes, those will now be applied, and we can ensure that those are required checks before you ever merge a pull request. So let me go back here and let's take a look at that. Right. You can see they're showing up here as well as, hey, these are some checks that need to occur and be finished up before you can even merge, right? The merge is being blocked. So definitely consider that when you're working with GitHub Actions, when you're trying to automate and building controls for your CI/CD and SDLC process. All right. Well, everyone, we really appreciate your time. Me and Dean will be on here for a few minutes. I think really, Dean, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear some of your experiences recently with GitHub Actions. It's been a really big and open platform. I think we have a couple announcements here we can share. For me, one big one is, hey, it's actually on beta for GitHub Enterprise Server. So if you're an enterprise customer out there for Enterprise Server, please look at our latest release. That is 2.2.0. We'll drop a link in here in the chat, but you can join the beta for this. Just reach out to probably your account team, but it could definitely be a really cool solution. Really excited to see Actions on GitHub Enterprise. And for our last few minutes here, y'all, I'm actually going to pull up for those on our public roadmap. If you do recall, maybe some of y'all did not know this, GitHub now has a public roadmap. So this will be showing you a list of different activities and items and features that are being coming to our product over the next quarter or two. So there's a repository I shared in chat. There's a couple of information you can see about it and read about how it works, how we're lining it out, and different tags we're using for it. But if I go over here to my project board, I'll show you a kind of breakdown of some things coming down the pipeline. And hey, Nitin, I see you asked, are these new features added to the GitHub Docs? Yes, they definitely are. Our GitHub Docs website, I was using it today. Actually, I think I use it every day for different references to materials. So we keep a real good job of updating those and making sure that any new features are reflected out there, including a couple of new things we are releasing in beta, such as you may have seen container registry, and a couple of new features for GitHub Actions as well, updating the APIs, etc. So you can always rely on the GitHub Docs for that. There's showing a few things that have been coming out, especially in terms of GitHub Actions. And this is going to be by end of calendar year, what we have currently scheduled. We're going to be having manual approvals and workflows. This is something we've heard from a lot of customers about. as well as workflow visualization. So being able to really see a picture of what's going on in the SDLC process, as well as additional things we're having here. Some things such as looking at Git action events in the audit log for GitHub Enterprise Cloud. So some additional controls are going to be adding into GitHub as well. All right, everyone. No rush to leave or anything like that. Feel free to join us if you have any more questions. I do want to shout out, there should be a link to our sales contact down below on Twitch if you need to look at anything as well or reach out to us. You can see this bright little image says contact GitHub sales. And feel free to reach out for any questions or inquiries about how we can better serve your enterprise. All right, my friends, appreciate it. Hope everyone has a safe weekend, wherever you're at in the world, night, day, or evening, and see you next time. Thanks, everyone. And thank you to Dean for being a great moderator.